Okay, so Bashar al-Assad, I mean, everyone's heard the name, right? But do we really know the guy?
Yeah, I think that's a good question.
Today we're doing a deep dive, going way beyond just the headlines.
Definitely.
We're tracing his story, starting with something pretty unexpected, his early career, and then through decades in power,
Right.
and ending up with him fleeing into exile just this month.
It's quite a story when you lay it all out like that.
It really is.
Yeah.
And to do this, we're using a bunch of sources you sent over some really fascinating stuff in here.
It is a really fascinating story, one that's easy to oversimplify.
For sure.
But the reality is much more nuanced, as always.
And that nuance is exactly what we're after, right?
Exactly.
Now, quick note before we really get going. This is obviously a sensitive topic.
Sure.
So our goal is to just present the info objectively.
Right.
We're not taking sides.
Of course.
Think of us like your guides through all this dense history.
Exactly. The goal is to understand, not to judge.
Exactly. Okay, so let's rewind way back before the dictatorship. It might surprise you to learn that Bashar al-Assad, he trained as an ophthalmologist in London.
Yeah, not your typical dictator origin story.
An eye doctor.
Hmm.
Does this make his later actions even more shocking, or is this all calculated,
It's a really interesting question. It definitely challenges that image we have of him as a power-hungry,
Yeah.
like he was born to be a dictator.
Right.
But at the same time, we can't ignore his upbringing, right?
Hmm.
His father, Hafez al-Assad, ruled Syria for 30 years. So Bashar wasn't just any doctor, he was the son of a dictator.
Yeah, the al-Assad dynasty
Yeah,
and their family's Alawite background, that can't be overlooked, can it?
absolutely. The Alawite identity, it kind of did two things for the Assads. On the one hand, it created this strong sense of loyalty among their base.
Right.
But it also led to tension with other groups, mainly the Sunni majority, and this sectarian dynamic that's going to come up again and again throughout Bashar's rule.
Okay, so with that in mind, let's jump ahead to the year 2000, Hafez al-Assad guys. And this sets the stage for Bashar to take over. And here's where things get interesting. The Syrian constitution, it's conveniently amended to allow the 34-year-old Bashar to assume power.
Yeah, that's textbook authoritarian playbook, isn't it? Changing the rules to fit the outcome they want.
Exactly. And the election that follows, oh, wow, over 97% support for Bashar. I mean, come on.
Right, what are the chances?
You have to wonder how those numbers are even possible.
Well, you have to think about the tactics they were likely using. Ballot stuffing, voter intimidation, disqualifying opposition candidates. I mean, there's no way that was a fair contest.
It's just mind-blowing, the level of control. And then any hope for democratic reform that was quickly shut down during the Damascus Spring, right?
Right, Damascus Spring. Oh, that was a brief moment when it seemed like things might open up.
Yeah.
But Assad, he shut it down fast. Showed everyone he was willing to use force to silence dissent, and I think in a way that foreshadowed what was to come.
Right. And then in 2005, you have the assassination of Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri.
Right.
That puts Assad on the world stage in a whole new light.
Af-
The UN investigation, they implicated Syria. So suddenly, this wasn't just a local power play anymore. This had international consequences.
It definitely cast a dark shadow over Assad's regime, and it marked a turning point in his relationship with the West.
But here's the thing. Just a few years earlier, after 9/11, Assad's Syria was actually a key intelligence ally for the CIA in the fight against al-Qaeda.
That's right. It's wild to think about now, isn't it?
It really is. It
Yeah.
just shows you how complicated international relations can be.
For sure. The world was a very different place after 9/11. The West was desperate for information on al-Qaeda, and Assad, surprisingly, he was willing to provide it. He even participated in the Extraordinary Rendition Program.
Wow, so we've got Assad, this dictator in the making, working with the CIA, but that partnership, it wasn't going to last.
Nope.
When the Arab Spring hit in 2011, Assad's brutal crackdown on protesters that changed everything.
It did. While other leaders across the region were being pressured to step down, Assad doubled down on his power. He chose violence over reform, and that's what plunged Syria into this devastating civil war.
A war with a death toll in the hundreds of thousands. Millions displaced, a massive refugee crisis that's still going on today.
The human cost of Assad's grip on power is just immeasurable.
To understand how he stayed in power for so long, we need to look at how he controlled the narrative and suppressed dissent. Let's start with the Mukhabarat, his secret police force.
Oh yeah, the Mukhabarat, they were the muscle behind Assad's regime. Everywhere you turn, they were there. Their power was absolute.
I've read that the ratio of secret police to civilians in Syria was something like 1 to 158.
Imagine that. For every 158 people, there's a secret police officer watching you.
That's terrifying. It creates an atmosphere of constant suspicion and fear. What kind of tactics did they use to maintain that level of control?
All kinds of things. Traditional surveillance, of course, tapping phones, intercepting communications,
Right.
but also psychological stuff, too. Infiltrating communities, recruiting informants. They could arrest, detain, and torture people without any due process.
It sounds straight out of a dystopian novel.
It really does. And this control, it wasn't limited to the Mukhabarat. The Ba'ath Party, they had their fingers in every part of Syrian life.
Right, they were calling the shots everywhere.
In the government, the military, the economy, the media. They rigged elections to make sure Assad stayed in power. They censored any information that challenged their narrative.
So basically, they created an echo chamber where any opposing voices were silenced, and dissent was met with, swift and brutal punishment.
That's right. And tragically, a lot of this repression, it had a sectarian element to it, too, with accusations of ethnic cleansing, targeting Sunni populations, a really dark chapter in Syria's history. And it points to the strategy of consolidating power by targeting specific communities seen as a threat.
So we've seen how Assad built this system of fear, surveillance, and repression. But even the strongest dictatorships, they can crumble.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the recent events that led to his downfall.
Right after years of brutal civil war, this stunning rebel offensive, it toppled the regime, and Assad was forced to flee to Moscow just days ago.
It was so sudden. It seemed like his power was unshakable.
It did, didn't it?
What caused this collapse?
Well, there are a few things. First, the rebels, they started gaining a lot of ground militarily. They inflicted heavy losses on Assad's forces, and they took control of key areas.
And the years of sanctions against Syria, they must have played a part too, right?
Definitely. The sanctions crippled Syria's economy. Assad couldn't finance the war as easily, and it led to widespread hardship for ordinary Syrians, which further eroded his support.
And even within his own Alawite community, support for Assad was waning as the war dragged on.
Right. Endless war, it took its toll. People got tired of it. Even those who had initially supported Assad, they started to question him. This loss of support within his own base, that really weakened his position.
So it was like a perfect storm of internal and external factors that led to his downfall. But Assad's exile, that's not the end of the story. There are still so many questions about what happens next.
Absolutely. What happens to a dictator in exile? Will he face trial for war crimes? What about the millions of refugees?
Right, what about the future of Syria itself?
It's all very uncertain. The situation is incredibly fluid, and the path forward is anything but clear.
It's really hard to grasp the scale of this suffering.
It truly is a tragedy of immense proportions.
And the international community has an obligation to help in any way it can.
Absolutely. We can't just turn away from this.
But there are geopolitical factors to consider as
Yeah.
well. Assad's removal creates this power vacuum in a region that's already really unstable.
For sure. And I don't think Russia, Assad's main backer, is going to be happy about this.
Not at all.
Yeah.
They put a lot of resources into propping up Assad's regime. They're not going to want to lose their influence in Syria, even without Assad in power.
Exactly. So we could see new proxy conflicts and more international maneuvering, even with Assad gone.
So we've covered a lot here, from Assad's early days to his brutal tactics to his sudden fall from power. But before we move on, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about the complexity of his story.
Yeah.
It's easy to just label him as evil,
It is tempting to oversimplify things.
but the reality is much more nuanced.
It always is.
I think that's a key takeaway for our listeners today. This isn't just about one bad guy. This is about a system that allowed this kind of brutality to go on for decades.
Right. That's exactly right.
And it's a system that we need to understand if we want to prevent something like this from happening again.
Absolutely. We have to learn from history.
We've covered a lot of heavy stuff today, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought.
Okay.
Knowing what we know now about how Assad stayed in power, the surveillance, the propaganda, the brutal crackdown on any kind of dissent, how can we as informed citizens be more aware of these kinds of things? How can we identify and address these patterns of behavior in other leaders, other countries, before it's too late?
That's such an important question. We can't just stand by and watch these things happen again.
Exactly. We have to be proactive.
We have to learn from the past and use that knowledge to create a better future.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to move on to a slightly lighter topic. But before we do, let's just take a moment to really reflect on what we've talked about today. The story of Bashar al-Assad. It's a stark reminder of how fragile peace is and how important it is to hold our leaders accountable for their actions.
It's a lesson that we should all carry with us.
We'll be back after a short break to explore a fascinating new world.
You know, it's amazing how quickly Assad's regime fell apart in just these past few weeks.
I know, it seemed like it happened overnight.
It really did. Intelligence reports suggest that even his closest allies were caught completely off guard by how fast the rebels were advancing.
So it's like the whole structure of his regime just vanished.
In a way, that's exactly what happened.
Hmm.
The foundations had been tracking for years, but the final blow was so swift it caught everyone by surprise. I mean, it seems like even Assad himself didn't see it coming.
So let's step back for a second and look at the bigger picture. What are the implications of all this? What does Assad's downfall mean for Syria, for the whole region?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. Syria's future is incredibly uncertain. The country's been ravaged by war, it's deeply divided, and there's no clear roadmap to peace or stability.
And then there are the millions of refugees scattered all over the region and the world. What happens to them? Will they ever be able to go home?
It all depends on what happens in Syria itself. Rebuilding the country, both physically and in terms of its social fabric, that's a monumental task. It's hard to say if or when it will be safe enough for them to return.
It's just heartbreaking. The scale of the suffering is almost impossible to comprehend.
It's a tragedy on such a massive scale, and the international community has a moral imperative to help in whatever way it can. But there are geopolitical ramifications to consider as well. Assad's removal creates this power vacuum in a region that's already grappling with instability.
And I'm sure Russia's Assad's biggest backer. They're not going to be pleased with this turn of events.
Definitely not list. Russia invested a lot in propping up Assad's regime, both militarily and financially. Losing their foothold in Syria is a major setback for them. They'll probably try to hold on to some influence in the country even without Assad in charge.
So we could be looking at a whole new wave of proxy conflicts and international power struggles in Syria?
It's definitely a possibility. The stakes are high, and there are a lot of players vying for control and influence. The situation is constantly changing, so it's really hard to predict what the long-term consequences will be.
We've covered a lot of ground today. From Assad's unexpected beginnings to the brutal ways he held on to power and ultimately his dramatic fall. But before we move on, I want to touch on something you said earlier about the complexity of his story.
Oh, yeah.
It's so easy to just see him as a one-dimensional villain.
Right, to just simplify everything.
But the reality is much more nuanced than that.
Absolutely. There's always more to the story.
And I think that's a really important takeaway for our listeners. It's not just about one bad guy. This is about a system, a whole web of power and corruption that allowed this level of brutality to go on for decades.
That's exactly it. And it's a system that we need to understand better if we want to stop this kind of thing from happening again.
This deep dive has been pretty heavy, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought, almost a challenge.
Okay, I'm listening.
We've learned a lot about the tactics Assad used to stay in power. The surveillance, the propaganda, the brutal crackdown on any kind of dissent. So knowing all that, how can we as informed citizens be more vigilant? How can we spot these kinds of patterns of behavior in other leaders, other countries, before it's too late?
That's the question, isn't it? We have to learn from history. We can't just let these things happen over and over
We
again.
have to be more aware, more proactive.
Exactly. We have to use what we've learned to make a difference to work towards a better future.
Well said. So on that note, we're going to shift gears and explore something a little lighter. But first, I think it's important to just pause and reflect on everything we've discussed today. The story of Bashar al-Assad, it's a stark reminder of how fragile peace can be and how crucial it is to hold our leaders accountable for their actions.
It's a lesson we should never forget.
We'll be right back after a short break to dive into a fascinating world. We spent a lot of time talking about Bashar al-Assad, his life, his rule, from eye doctor to dictator to exile in Moscow. I mean, what a story.
Yeah, it's a story that really highlights how complicated power can be, the human cost of conflict, and the constant search for justice. And even though Assad's gone, the story's not over, is it?
Not by a long shot. So what happens to a dictator in exile? Does he just fade away, or does he face some kind of consequences for what he did?
I think a lot of people are wondering that, especially the people who suffered under Assad's rule, history doesn't really give us a clear answer. Some dictators live out their days comfortably in exile, others end up on trial, some are even extradited back to their countries to face justice.
So for Assad, it's really up in the air.
Exactly. It depends on the political climate, the will of the international community, and the strength of the evidence against him. There are investigations going on, including one by the International Criminal Court. But even the ICC, they have their limits.
Right. Syria would have to be a member of the court for them to have jurisdiction, or the UN Security Council would have to refer the case to them. And with Russia being such a close ally of Assad, A referral seems pretty unlikely.
You're right. Given the current political situation, a referral is a long shot. But it's important to remember that justice, it can take many forms and it can take time.
So even if it doesn't seem likely right now, there's still a chance that Assad could be held accountable.
Absolutely. The wheels of justice, they turn slowly, especially when it comes to international matters. But the pursuit of accountability, even when it's difficult, it sends a powerful message. It tells the world that those who commit atrocities will be held responsible, even if it takes a long time.
It's about sending a message that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. Our look at Bashar al-Assad has been eye-opening. We've seen him go from an ophthalmologist in London to a dictator ruling with an iron fist, from a surprising intelligence asset to a global outcast, and finally to exile in Moscow. And this deep dive, it hasn't just been about one man. It's about the system that enabled this kind of brutality to go on for decades.
It's a stark reminder that we have to be vigilant. We have to recognize the signs of authoritarianism, and we have to actively work to prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening again.
That's a crucial message. So to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey into the complex story of Bashar al-Assad. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.
We hope it's inspired you to learn more about the world and to speak out against injustice wherever you see it.
It's been a heavy topic, but an important one. And as we wrap up today, we encourage you to keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better future for everyone.
Thank you for listening.